one of the audiences I speak to a lot are learning and development people responsible for talent and human resources. And this notion of the alliance completely freaks them out, because a lot of the premises that much of our HR doctrine is based on are this sort of notion of careers as ladders and long-term relationships, and you have this career planning thing that you do 3 or 4 or 10 steps forward, and the alliance really flies in the face of a lot of that. And one of the more interesting aspects, I think, is that today the networks that we form, and you and I are part of the Silicon Guild. That's how we met, as I recall, which is a group of nonfiction authors that really try to support and nurture each other's endeavors. But one of the things I find most interesting is that our networks, irrespective of what organization we happen to be part of at any given point in time, tend to be more durable across those boundaries, which I think is just a really interesting idea for people to get their heads around. So, I know one of my recent MBA graduates was handed this project by her partners at a consulting firm, and she finished it in like record time. And they're like, "How did you do that?" And she said, "Oh, well, I have this network of friends, and then one of them's a great design person, another one's a great statistician, and she put together this like virtual network of people." And this is the interesting part, who work for competing organizations, and they all piled in to help her with her project. I mean, where in the HR manual does that stuff exist? I don't know.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a broader point here, which is because of the internet, and this is the thing that's really changed everything. Because of the internet, we're all connected by a global electronic network, right? We are able to be connected more than ever before. We're able to stay in touch with people more than ever before. We have things like social media to maintain relationships, which otherwise might have withered because people are on different continents or what have you. And that's reflected in the fact that this is what my co-author Reid Hoffman has dubbed the networked age. And what you just described is how the power of networks is now a part of our careers, a part of how we do work, a part of everything we do. And recognizing the power of the network and recognizing that we now live networked lives is a big part of being successful in this modern age.
Absolutely. So one of the questions one of our guests has asked is, what's the difference between writing and creative writing?
So excellent question. Again, in many ways, all writing is creative. But in the academic setting, creative writing is specifically used to focus on fiction and poetry. So, and arguably poetry is also in the fictional category. Interestingly enough, I studied all different types of writing when I was at Stanford. In addition to traditional creative writing and fiction writing, literary fiction writing, I also studied poetry. I also studied literary nonfiction, which, as it turns out, was a great preparation for my actual career, as well as experimental fiction. So I try to draw on all of these different experiences, and I think that they all fall under the classic category. It's stereotypical, but true, of storytelling, and being able to understand storytelling in all its forms is really powerful. But in that very specific, narrow sense, creative writing refers to fiction and poetry.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, Jeff, I don't want to leave you out here. And I know you've been entrepreneurial in a number of different settings, including in a university setting, which, ASU is an institution I just have the huge amount of regard for. Maybe share with us a little bit about your background and what you've done there.
Sure, thank you. Well, I grew up in Chicago and always knew that I wanted to work internationally. And like Chris, I had taken some creative writing classes in college, but I launched off on an international management program just before globalization was common, just before all MBA programs became global. And I attended Thunderbird School of Global Management because I was really hell-bent on getting overseas. And first, that took me to become a visiting foreign professor at the ripe old age of 26 at the Tech of Monterrey, which is Mexico and Latin America's largest and one of the leading business schools. And it was a fantastic experience to kind of bridge the world of academia and business, because as I soon found out, a business school professor, even a 26-year-old one with only a master's degree, is someone held in incredibly high esteem. And I reached out for advice because, of course, I was really in over my head with 2 weeks to prepare for classes that had never been taught before. So I reached out.
We should mention you were teaching the classes in Spanish as well.
Yes.
What?
And at the time, because we were not yet in a networked age, when I visited the management section at the library, there were only 40 books in the category of management and marketing to draw upon. And there was no internet, no other place to get material. So I hopped on an airplane and flew back to Phoenix and went rather frantically, to be honest, knocking on all the doors of former professors and others that had never been my professors, and said, listen, you know, I have this job. I have to teach a class that starts in 2 weeks, and they don't know what it's supposed to be about, and I really don't either. Can you help? And so anyway, I was able to pull together a lot of source material, and fortunately, you know, when you teach something, you actually learn more than your students. Went on to have the most popular class at the university, and soon my syllabus had been adopted by the other 4 sections of professors who wanted to use it. But along the way, I made a wonderful relationship with someone who remains a friend to this day, Dr. Robert T. Moran, emeritus professor of Thunderbird, who, along with Philip R. Harris, were the authors of Managing Cultural Differences, a book that came out in the late 70s that was sort of the seminal work in cross-cultural management. And at that time, Bob was about my age now. And you know, like Gary Hamel and many others at that time, C.K. Prahalad was jetting all over the world, consulting for major organizations like Toyota. And I invited him down to a symposium to address the 6,000 students of management who loved his book and wanted to meet him and hear from him. And he came down and, you know, predictably amazed everyone with his insights. Because also in 1994, the border between the US and Mexico was more than a figment of one's imagination. There were no information flows. And in fact, talking about the networked age, the books and the articles that I brought back that I had in my office were the only copies of them at that university. And the department head said to me, you know, Jeff, I'd really like to have your books and articles in my office, because you work here for me and I want to have the department library. And I said, well, that's unacceptable to me because I come in earlier than you and I often review them and prepare for my classes, which start at 8. And it's inconvenient for me to have to, you know, make an appointment with you in advance to have access to my own materials. But just to, you know, lend some gravity to the importance of the internet, the networked age, the lengths that I had to go through in 1994 to access information, to retain access to information in order to teach a class, and how all of that has changed. And just a little plug for a book that's now 25 years old is during Robert Moran's visit, which also the symposium was also attended by then former President Ronald Reagan. I said, you know, it's really shocking that Mexicans, Americans, and other, you know, other managers in North America have so little understanding of one another. And here we are embarking on the North American Free Trade Agreement. I'd really like to contribute something to the conversation and shed some light on management practices and, you know, what it takes to be effective between the two. And he said, well, how would you like to write a book with me? He said, no, it doesn't mean I'm going to do all the work. I can help us get the contract, but in this case, you're going to do most of the work because, you know, my work has already been done. And so we sketched out the table of contents on the back of a napkin over breakfast. And I ended up spending the next year working on a book that's called NAFTA, Managing the Cultural Differences, which was a small paperback meant to be a handbook for managers on the do's and don'ts of working effectively across borders and across cultures in North America. A book that went on to, you know, be influential in the circles that we worked in, but was not a great commercial success. And but anyway, I think it serves to illustrate the point about the networked age, the importance of access to information. And jump forward 20 years after that, I found myself back at a university, at Arizona State University, running the entrepreneurship programs, specifically the acceleration programs and the curriculum for the largest university in the country, with 5 different programs and tens of thousands of online learners. And what a contrast that by that time, all of the best practices of Silicon Valley of starting companies had been codified and published and could be downloaded as a PDF. And my job was more an act of curation and filtering and assembling than you know, the need to discover and digest and produce. And so in that capacity, I developed the first online curriculum and made that available to ASU and the broader community. And that's what really served as the launching point for beginning to work with Chris on taking some of those same learnings, both about entrepreneurship, about the nuts and bolts of building a business and curriculum, and trying to project that internationally to work with scaling founders in places of the world that still suffered from some of the same dearth of access and perhaps dearth of connectivity that I experienced 20 years earlier in my first stint in Mexico. And that's what 4 or 5 years later has morphed into the Global Scaling Academy, which is our effort to take the wonderful work of Chris and Reid and Ben, along with other work that's relevant, and make that available to a select group of scaling founders in communities around the world that may not have access either to the connectivity or to the content, and to put those two together in a way that hopefully can help catapult their ability to scale their business from wherever they are. And so I think that, you know, is a good place to stop and kind of ties back everything.